In May 1967, as the Cold War's attention remained fixed on Europe and Southeast Asia, a devastating conflict erupted in West Africa that would expose the limits of superpower concern and redefine how war was seen by the global public, because the Biafran War unfolded not as a conventional proxy struggle, but as a humanitarian catastrophe shaped by postcolonial fracture, ethnic fear, and geopolitical indifference. And this mattered because it revealed how conflicts that did not align neatly with Cold War strategic priorities could be allowed to burn unchecked, even as they produced suffering on a scale that shocked the world. And the roots of the war lay in the fragile construction of Nigeria itself, a state assembled through colonial administration rather than organic political cohesion, where deep ethnic, regional, and religious divisions were contained temporarily by British rule, but left unresolved at independence in 1960, creating a political system in which power sharing was unstable and mistrust pervasive. And this instability was magnified by competition over resources, particularly oil in the southeastern region, where the Igbo population feared marginalization within a federal structure dominated by rival groups. And as Nigeria's early years were marked by coups, counter-coups, and massacres, especially the mass killings of Igbo civilians in the north during 1966, the sense that the state could no longer guarantee protection became widespread, transforming political grievance into existential fear. And this fear mattered because it reframed secession not as an ideological project, but as a survival strategy, leading the eastern region under Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu to declare independence as the Republic of Biafra in May 1967, an act that challenged not only Nigerian sovereignty, but the post-colonial principle that borders inherited from empire were inviolable. And for the Nigerian federal government, this declaration represented an intolerable precedent because allowing secession risked the fragmentation of the state and the unraveling of authority across a region already struggling to maintain cohesion. And this fear drove the decision to pursue reunification by force, setting in motion a war that would last nearly 3 years and claim the lives of more than 1 million people, most of them civilians, and from the outset, the conflict was shaped by asymmetry, as the federal government possessed superior manpower and resources, while Biafra relied on improvised defenses, limited foreign support, and a narrative of victimhood designed to mobilize international sympathy. And this narrative mattered because it transformed the war into one of the first conflicts where media imagery played a decisive role, as photographs of starving children circulated globally, challenging audiences to confront suffering that could no longer be ignored. And yet, despite this visibility, the international response remained fragmented and cautious, constrained by Cold War calculations that prioritized stability over intervention. And for the major powers, the Biafran War posed an awkward dilemma because Nigeria did not fit cleanly into the binary logic of East versus West, and both blocs had reasons to support the federal government while avoiding deep entanglement, with Britain backing Nigeria to preserve influence and access to oil, the Soviet Union supplying arms to assert presence in Africa without ideological commitment, and the United States maintaining distance, reluctant to alienate a large African state while wary of involvement in a complex civil war. And this convergence of restraint mattered because it effectively sealed Biafra's fate, ensuring that no decisive external pressure would force a negotiated settlement. And as the war progressed, the Nigerian strategy increasingly relied on blockade, cutting off food and medical supplies to the secessionist region, a tactic justified as a means of hastening surrender, but one that produced catastrophic humanitarian consequences, because starvation became the primary weapon of the conflict, and the images that emerged from Biafra, of emaciated children and overwhelmed aid workers reshaped global consciousness, marking a turning point in how war and suffering were perceived by distant audiences. And this mattered because it exposed a profound dissonance between moral outrage and political action, as governments expressed concern while declining to intervene decisively, revealing the limits of compassion in a system governed by sovereignty and strategic interest. And for Biafra, the use of humanitarian imagery became both a lifeline and a trap, drawing aid and attention while reinforcing the perception that survival depended on external sympathy rather than military victory. And as the war dragged on, the suffering intensified, with malnutrition, disease, and displacement overwhelming the population, while federal forces tightened their grip, and the absence of effective mediation reflected the Cold War's structural bias toward stability over justice. Because preserving Nigeria's territorial integrity was deemed more important than addressing the human cost of reunification. And this prioritization mattered because it signaled to postcolonial states that sovereignty would be defended, even at extraordinary humanitarian cost, shaping how future conflicts were managed or ignored. And in January 1970, the war ended with Biafra's surrender, its leadership fleeing or captured, and the federal government declaring a policy of reconciliation without retribution, an attempt to reintegrate the region and restore national unity. Yet the scars left by the conflict were profound because the war had exposed the fragility of post-colonial statehood, the power of media to shape perception without guaranteeing action, and the willingness of the international system to tolerate mass suffering when it did not threaten strategic balance. And in this sense, the Biafran War stands as one of the Cold War's most haunting episodes, not because it altered the global balance of power, but because it revealed the moral blind spots of an era in which millions could die in full view of the world while the great powers looked on, constrained not by ignorance but by indifference. And as a result, the conflict left a legacy that extended beyond Nigeria, influencing the development of humanitarian activism, the ethics of intervention, and the understanding that in the Cold War, some wars mattered not for who won them, but for what they revealed about the limits of global responsibility. As the war intensified after the initial declaration of Biafran independence, the conflict quickly evolved from a conventional secessionist struggle into a campaign defined by attrition and isolation, because the Nigerian federal government recognized that outright battlefield victory was less decisive than cutting Biafra off from the outside world. And this mattered because it transformed the war into one where civilian survival became inseparable from military strategy, blurring the line between combatant and non-combatant in ways that would haunt the conflict's legacy. And the imposition of a comprehensive blockade by land, sea, and air gradually strangled the secessionist territory, limiting its ability to import food, medicine, and fuel, while federal forces advanced methodically, capturing territory and tightening the perimeter. And for Biafra, this strategy posed an existential threat because its leadership lacked the industrial base or external patronage needed to sustain prolonged isolation, forcing it to rely increasingly on airlifts, smuggling, and the moral leverage of international sympathy. And this reliance mattered because it pushed the conflict into a new arena, one defined not by troop movements alone, but by the circulation of images, narratives, and appeals to conscience. And as humanitarian organizations and journalists gained limited access, the suffering inside Biafra became visible in unprecedented ways, with photographs of famine and disease circulating across Europe and North America, confronting audiences with a war that challenged assumptions about distance and responsibility. And this visibility mattered because it marked one of the earliest moments when mass media transformed a distant civil war into a global moral spectacle. shaping public opinion even as governments remained cautious, and the dissonance between public outrage and official restraint became increasingly stark as charitable donations surged while diplomatic initiatives stalled, revealing a structural gap between humanitarian impulse and geopolitical calculation. And within the Cold War framework, this gap reflected the fact that Nigeria occupied an ambiguous position, because it was neither a clear ally nor a client of either bloc, allowing both the United States and the Soviet Union to support the federal government's territorial integrity without framing the conflict as an ideological struggle. And this convergence mattered because it deprived Biafra of a powerful sponsor, capable of forcing negotiations, leaving it dependent on marginal actors and private networks that could alleviate suffering but not alter the balance of power. And as the blockade took its toll, starvation emerged as the defining feature of the war, not as an unintended byproduct, but as a deliberate consequence of strategy, justified by the federal government as a means to compel surrender, while framed by Biafran leaders as evidence of genocidal intent. And this framing mattered because it hardened positions on both sides, making compromise politically costly and morally fraught. And the longer the war continued, the more entrenched these narratives became, as each side sought to mobilize legitimacy through competing claims of necessity and victimhood. And for the international community, the persistence of famine posed an uncomfortable challenge, because acknowledging responsibility risked undermining the principle of non-interference that governed postcolonial relations, while intervention risked setting precedents that could destabilize fragile states elsewhere. And this dilemma mattered because it revealed how Cold War norms of sovereignty constrained humanitarian action, even in the face of mass suffering. And as 1968 and 1969 passed, the human cost mounted relentlessly, with entire communities weakened by malnutrition and disease, while relief efforts struggled against logistical barriers and political obstruction. And the war's drawn-out nature exposed the limits of compassion when unaccompanied by power, demonstrating that visibility alone could not compel decisive action. And in this sense, the Biafran War became a grim lesson in the hierarchy of global concern, showing that even when suffering was undeniable and widely broadcast, it could still be subordinated to strategic caution and the preservation of existing borders, reinforcing the Cold War reality that some conflicts were allowed to run their course, not because they were misunderstood, but because intervening was deemed too costly or disruptive, a reality that would shape responses to humanitarian crises for decades to come. As the humanitarian catastrophe deepened, the Biafran War increasingly revealed how post-colonial state survival and Cold War restraint converged to produce a conflict in which suffering was tolerated as a tool of resolution, because the Nigerian federal government, led by Yakubu Gowon, framed the blockade and continued offensive as a necessary assertion of sovereignty rather than as a discretionary strategy. And this mattered because it recast famine from an ethical emergency into a political inevitability, insulating policy from external pressure by embedding it within the widely accepted principle that colonial borders must remain intact. And as long as that principle remained unchallenged, Nigeria could prosecute reunification without fear of decisive intervention, even as civilian casualties mounted. And for the superpowers, this logic was convenient, because it allowed them to express concern while avoiding entanglement, reinforcing a pattern in which African conflicts that did not threaten great power equilibrium were managed through distance and rhetoric rather than action. And this distance mattered because it shaped the war's trajectory, depriving Biafra of leverage, while signaling to other post-colonial states that internal conflicts would be judged primarily through the lens of stability rather than human cost. And as relief flights struggled to deliver aid through night landings and clandestine corridors, the limits of humanitarian action became starkly visible because assistance could alleviate suffering at the margins, but could not overcome a strategy designed to deny resources at scale. And this asymmetry mattered because it revealed a central paradox of modern humanitarianism, that compassion without power cannot alter outcomes when political actors are committed to victory at any cost. And the images that continued to circulate of skeletal children and overwhelmed clinics intensified public outrage in Europe and North America. Yet this outrage translated into pressure on charities more than on governments, creating a feedback loop in which humanitarian response expanded even as political paralysis persisted. And this gap mattered because it normalized a division of labor in which moral responsibility was outsourced to non-state actors, while states retained control over decisions that determined life and death. And within Nigeria, the federal government pursued a narrative of reconciliation, insisting that defeat would be followed by reintegration and forgiveness, a promise intended to blunt accusations of collective punishment and to reassure a broader African audience wary of secessionist contagion. And this narrative mattered because it helped sustain regional support for Nigeria's position, reinforcing the idea that reunification, however brutal, was preferable to fragmentation. And as federal forces advanced and Biafran territory shrank, the war's outcome became increasingly inevitable. Yet inevitability did not shorten suffering, because surrender required the collapse of administrative capacity and morale under conditions of deprivation that left civilians with little agency. And this prolonged agony underscored how wars of attrition impose costs not only through violence, but through time itself, as weeks and months of deprivation erode bodies and communities beyond repair. And by late 1969, the secessionist government faced an impossible choice between continued resistance that guaranteed further starvation and capitulation that promised survival at the cost of autonomy. And when surrender finally came in January 1970, it did so not as a negotiated settlement, but as a collapse, marking the end of Biafra as a political entity and the absorption of its population back into Nigeria under terms dictated by the victor. And while the federal government's declaration of no victor, no vanquished sought to frame the outcome as restorative rather than punitive, the social and psychological damage inflicted by years of famine and displacement could not be undone by rhetoric. And this mattered because it shaped post-war memory and mistrust, embedding the conflict within Nigeria's national consciousness as an unresolved trauma rather than a closed chapter. And internationally, the war's end did not resolve the ethical questions it raised, because the absence of accountability for the use of starvation as a strategy reinforced the lesson that humanitarian norms remain subordinate to sovereignty and strategic caution, a lesson that would echo in subsequent crises. And in Cold War terms, the Biafran War thus stands as a case study in indifference rather than intervention, illustrating how global systems can absorb extraordinary suffering without altering course when core interests are not at stake. And by exposing the limits of media-driven compassion and the constraints of non-interference, the conflict reshaped debates about humanitarian responsibility, planting the seeds for future activism, while simultaneously demonstrating how difficult it is to translate moral shock into political change. And in this sense, the war's legacy lies not only in the lives lost, but in the uncomfortable clarity it brought to the Cold War's moral hierarchy, revealing that some tragedies, even when seen by the world, were allowed to continue, because stopping them required challenging principles that the international system was unwilling to reconsider. As the guns fell silent and Biafra ceased to exist as a political entity, the aftermath of the war exposed how deeply the conflict had reshaped both Nigeria and the global understanding of humanitarian crisis, because The federal government's policy of reintegration, framed publicly as reconciliation without retribution, unfolded in a society traumatized by mass death, displacement, and deprivation. And this mattered because while the absence of large-scale reprisals avoided immediate renewed violence, it did not erase the structural inequalities, mistrust, and unresolved grievances that the war had intensified, leaving behind a fragile peace sustained more by exhaustion than by genuine healing. And within the former Biafran region, the return to Nigerian sovereignty brought relief from starvation, but also economic marginalization, as confiscated property, destroyed infrastructure, and limited access to capital-constrained recovery, reinforcing perceptions that the war's consequences extended beyond its formal end. And this perception mattered because it shaped collective memory, embedding the conflict as a lived experience of abandonment, rather than a resolved episode. And at the national level, the war reinforced the Nigerian state's commitment to territorial integrity as a core principle, discouraging future secessionist movements while also legitimizing strong central authority as a safeguard against fragmentation, a lesson that would influence Nigerian politics for decades. And this influence mattered because it demonstrated how civil wars can recalibrate state ideology, entrenching security-first governance in the name of unity. And internationally, the Biafran War's most enduring impact lay in the transformation of humanitarian consciousness, because the scale of suffering and the role of media galvanized new forms of activism that sought to bypass state paralysis, leading to the emergence of organizations and advocacy models that emphasized witnessing, urgency, and moral testimony. And this shift mattered because it marked a turning point in how distant suffering was framed, no longer as an abstract tragedy, but as a call to action, even when political solutions remained elusive. And yet this transformation coexisted with a sobering realization that awareness did not guarantee intervention, and that humanitarian response could expand dramatically without altering the strategic calculations that determined war and peace, a realization that shaped a more cynical but also more determined generation of activists. And within the Cold War framework, this legacy highlighted a profound asymmetry, because while superpower rivalry dictated attention and resources, conflicts that did not threaten the global balance were relegated to the margins, regardless of their human cost, reinforcing a hierarchy of concern that placed strategic stability above moral urgency. And this hierarchy mattered because it revealed how the Cold War structured not only military priorities, but ethical ones, determining which lives were protected by deterrence and which were exposed to neglect. And as scholars and policymakers reflected on Biafra in the years that followed, the war became a reference point in debates about intervention, sovereignty, and responsibility, invoked both as a cautionary tale of non-interference and as a catalyst for rethinking the limits of state-centric ethics. And in this sense, the Biafran War occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history, because it forced the world to confront the contradiction between visibility and action, showing that even when suffering was undeniable and widely broadcast, it could still be absorbed by an international system structured to privilege order over justice. And by laying bare this contradiction, the conflict reshaped how future crises were perceived, even as it underscored how difficult it would be to escape the constraints that had allowed such devastation to unfold, leaving a legacy defined not only by tragedy, but by the uncomfortable clarity it brought to the moral architecture of the Cold War. As the memory of the Biafran War settled into both Nigerian and international consciousness, its significance within the Cold War became increasingly clear, because the conflict revealed not a failure of information or awareness, but a failure of will embedded in the global order. And this mattered because it showed that even when suffering was fully visible and emotionally compelling, it could still be subordinated to principles of sovereignty and strategic caution that defined the era. And in this sense, Biafra was not ignored, but managed. Its catastrophe absorbed into a system that prioritized the preservation of borders and regional stability over humanitarian intervention. And this management shaped how future conflicts in Africa would be interpreted, signaling that internal wars, no matter how brutal, would be treated as domestic affairs unless they threatened superpower interests directly, a lesson that reinforced both state authority and civilian vulnerability. And within Nigeria, the war's legacy continued to influence political life, as the emphasis on unity and central control hardened into doctrine, constraining dissent and shaping responses to regional grievances long after the famine ended. And this internal consequence mattered because it demonstrated how civil war can redefine state identity around security and cohesion, often at the expense of pluralism and trust. And for the international community, the war's most enduring effect lay in the institutionalization of humanitarian response as a parallel system operating alongside, rather than within, political decision-making, as charities, activists, and relief agencies expanded their capacity to respond to crises, even as governments retained the authority to determine whether wars would continue. And this separation mattered because it normalized a world in which alleviating suffering became acceptable without confronting its causes, allowing moral action to coexist with political inaction. And as the Cold War progressed, this pattern repeated itself in other conflicts where humanitarian aid mitigated but did not prevent catastrophe, reinforcing the structural lesson first made stark in Biafra. And in historical perspective, the Biafran War thus stands as one of the Cold War's most unsettling episodes, not because it involved superpower confrontation, but because it exposed the ethical boundaries of an international system defined by non-interference and balance, showing that millions could die not in secrecy, but in full view of the world, and that visibility alone was insufficient to compel change. And by forcing this recognition, the war reshaped debates about responsibility, intervention, and the limits of compassion in a divided world, leaving a legacy that would influence humanitarian discourse for decades, even as it underscored how deeply entrenched the Cold War's moral hierarchy truly was. As the Biafran conflict receded into history, it gradually came to symbolize the moral fault line of the Cold War in Africa, because it exposed how geopolitical calculation and humanitarian awakening could coexist without reconciling. And this mattered because it set a precedent for how the world would treat later African wars, as tragedies to be managed, not solved. The images of famine that defined Biafra established the grammar of global empathy. The starving child, the distended stomach, the hollow-eyed survivor. Western publics learned to recognize suffering through this imagery, but governments learned an equally potent lesson, that outrage did not compel intervention when national interests were absent. The war's outcome therefore entrenched a cynical equilibrium. Africa would remain within the rhetorical space of decolonization, but outside the sphere of decisive Cold War action. Within Nigeria, this outcome hardened a culture of centralized power that prioritized unity over justice, embedding a political logic that treated dissent as potential disintegration. For the international humanitarian movement, Biafra marked both a beginning and a warning. It inspired the founding of organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières, born from the frustration of doctors who witnessed famine manipulated as strategy and refused the silence imposed by neutrality. Yet the same impulse that drove witness also birthed a humanitarian model dependent on spectacle, where moral urgency relied on visibility and where suffering unseen could still be ignored. This contradiction mattered because it institutionalized a system in which aid alleviated pain but rarely changed policy, turning relief into a permanent feature of global order rather than a challenge to it. In the broader Cold War context, Biafra illuminated the hierarchy of crises that defined superpower engagement. Europe and Asia received strategy. Africa received statements. By the 1970s, when other African conflicts erupted, the template was fixed. Superpowers would arm or advise, but rarely rescue. In this way, the Biafran War stood as a silent tutor for both power and pity, showing that in a world governed by blocks, moral outrage could coexist comfortably with political paralysis. Its legacy endures not only in humanitarian institutions, but in the uneasy knowledge that compassion, without consequence, is the most stable equilibrium the Cold War ever achieved. As scholars and policymakers revisited the Biafran War in later decades, its Cold War significance became increasingly defined by what it failed to change, because despite unprecedented media exposure and humanitarian mobilization, the structures that allowed mass starvation to be used as a weapon remained intact. And this mattered because it demonstrated that moral shock alone could not overcome the foundational principles of sovereignty and non-intervention that governed post-colonial order. And in this sense, Biafra functioned as a boundary case that clarified the limits of global responsibility rather than expanding them, and this clarification shaped how subsequent crises were approached, as governments learned that visible suffering could be managed through aid without altering strategic priorities, reinforcing a model in which relief substituted for resolution. And within Nigeria, the war's aftermath continued to influence political and social dynamics, as the memory of near fragmentation reinforced a state ideology centered on unity at all costs, discouraging decentralization and legitimizing strong executive authority as a bulwark against renewed secession. And this internal legacy mattered because it shaped responses to later grievances, embedding the logic of security-first governance in ways that constrained trust and reconciliation. And internationally, the war's impact on humanitarian practice proved paradoxical, because while it catalyzed new norms of witnessing and advocacy, it also entrenched a dependence on imagery and urgency that privileged crises that could be made visible over those that unfolded more quietly, reinforcing inequalities in attention that mirrored Cold War hierarchies of interest. And this dynamic mattered because it revealed how compassion itself could be shaped by geopolitical context, becoming selective and episodic rather than universal. And as the Cold War progressed and Africa remained a site of intermittent proxy engagement, the lessons of Biafra echoed quietly, reminding observers that the absence of decisive intervention was not always a failure of knowledge, but a reflection of calculated restraint. And in this sense, the war occupies a distinct place in Cold War history because it stripped away comforting illusions about the inevitability of moral progress, showing instead how ethical norms could advance rhetorically while remaining constrained operationally. And by exposing this gap, the Biafran War forced a reckoning with the reality that international systems can adapt to suffering without being transformed by it, a reality that continues to shape debates about intervention, responsibility, and the limits of humanitarianism in a world still governed by power. As the Cold War moved into the 1970s and attention shifted toward détente and superpower arms control, the Biafran War lingered as a suppressed reference point, shaping assumptions without commanding sustained reflection, because it had demonstrated that humanitarian catastrophe could unfold at full scale without triggering structural change in how power responded. And this mattered because it normalized a form of managed suffering in which crises were acknowledged, documented, and partially alleviated, yet allowed to run their course when intervention threatened existing political arrangements. And this normalization influenced how African conflicts were later framed, with violence and famine increasingly treated as tragic but endemic features of post-colonial instability rather than as failures of international responsibility. And within this framing, the Biafran experience served as a cautionary boundary, illustrating the risks of challenging inherited borders and reinforcing the idea that secession would be met not with negotiation, but with isolation, a lesson absorbed by both governments and movements across the continent. And this absorption mattered because it constrained political imagination, discouraging alternatives to centralized authority, even when state structures failed to protect populations. And at the global level, the war's legacy contributed to a quiet recalibration of Cold War ethics, as policymakers learned that expressions of concern, limited aid, and rhetorical neutrality were sufficient to deflect accountability, allowing strategic priorities to proceed unimpeded. And this recalibration mattered because it hardened the separation between moral discourse and political action, embedding a dual-track response system that persists to this day. And for historians, the enduring significance of Biafra lies in this institutional memory of inaction, because it shows how the Cold War produced not only doctrines of deterrence and containment, but also doctrines of neglect, determining which crises would mobilize power and which would be consigned to humanitarian management. And by revealing this hierarchy, the Biafran War stands as a stark reminder that the Cold War's most consequential effects were not always measured in territorial gains or ideological victories, but in the lives deemed peripheral to the balance of power, whose suffering was visible, recorded, and ultimately tolerated, shaping a legacy in which the limits of compassion were defined not by capacity, but by choice. As the full implications of the Biafran War settled into Cold War history, it became evident that the conflict had permanently altered how the international system understood both Africa and humanitarian crisis, because it revealed that visibility did not equate to priority, and that moral clarity did not guarantee political action. And this mattered, because it exposed a structural reality in which suffering could be acknowledged without being confronted, integrated into global consciousness without reshaping global behavior. And within this structure, Biafra became a reference point not for intervention but for restraint, a case that quietly instructed policymakers on how far humanitarian concern could be allowed to go without destabilizing existing power arrangements. And this instruction mattered because it reinforced a model in which aid replaced diplomacy and charity substituted for responsibility, allowing states to appear compassionate while avoiding the risks associated with challenging sovereignty or precedent. And for African politics, the lesson was equally stark, because the war confirmed that internal conflicts would be judged primarily through the lens of territorial integrity rather than civilian protection, discouraging secessionist movements while offering little reassurance to populations trapped within failing states. And this asymmetry mattered because it entrenched a system where state survival outweighed human security, shaping post-colonial governance and international engagement alike. And as debates about humanitarian intervention evolved in later decades, Biafra remained an unspoken benchmark, invoked implicitly whenever arguments arose about whether suffering justified crossing political boundaries, reminding decision-makers of the costs of precedent and the risks of intervention. And this lingering influence mattered because it showed how one conflict could constrain future choices long after its conclusion, not through explicit doctrine, but through accumulated caution. And in this sense, the Biafran War occupies a unique place in Cold War history, because it did not alter alliances or redraw borders. Yet, it reshaped expectations about what the world would tolerate, revealing the limits of empathy, in a system organized around power, and by doing so it left a legacy defined not by victory or defeat, but by the uneasy acceptance that some catastrophes would be managed rather than prevented, an acceptance that continues to shadow discussions of global responsibility to this day. In closing, the Biafran War of 1967-1970 stands as one of the Cold War's most unsettling conflicts because it exposed, with brutal clarity, how mass suffering could unfold in full view of the world without compelling decisive political action. And what makes the war so consequential is not that it altered the balance of power, but that it revealed the moral architecture of the Cold War itself, a system in which sovereignty, stability, and strategic caution consistently outweighed humanitarian urgency, even when starvation was used openly as a weapon. And this mattered because Biafra demonstrated that visibility was not enough to trigger intervention, that images could shock consciences while leaving policies unchanged, and that compassion could expand dramatically without threatening, the structures that allowed catastrophe to continue. And within Nigeria, the war hardened a doctrine of unity at all costs, embedding a legacy of centralized authority and unresolved grievance that would shape politics long after the famine ended. While internationally, the conflict helped institutionalize a model of humanitarian response that operated alongside, rather than against, political indifference, allowing aid to flow without forcing accountability. And this separation mattered because it normalized a world in which alleviating suffering became acceptable without preventing it, transforming relief into a permanent substitute for resolution. And in Cold War terms, the Biafran War thus revealed the hierarchy of global concern, showing that conflicts outside the main theaters of superpower rivalry could be tolerated regardless of their human toll, provided they did not threaten strategic equilibrium. And by laying bare this hierarchy, Biafra forced an uncomfortable recognition that the Cold War was not only a contest of ideologies and alliances, but a system that defined which lives were protected by deterrence and which were exposed to neglect. And as later generations debated intervention, responsibility, and humanitarian ethics, the shadow of Biafra lingered as a reminder that moral outrage without political consequence is a stable outcome in a world governed by power. And it is for this reason that the Biafran War remains one of the Cold War's most haunting episodes, because it showed that millions could die not in secrecy, but in plain sight, and that the true limit of the era was not information or capacity, but the willingness to act when action threatened established order, marking the conflict as a defining lesson in the indifference that shaped the Cold War's global periphery.